Where are we now? We miss you. We still don't say your name. To not out you, to not out us. The shame isn't ours to carry daily, we remember. Some say it's in the past. Memories flood back as it chokes our young. As many dead as are living. Perhaps it feels like a lifetime ago. They say we've got a lifetime to go. We plan for old age. A generation who'll never know, a generation born to see it all. My loves, we continue repositioning our legacy. My loves, we wish you could have been here to see it all.
The UK's Memorial Quilt is a collection of quilts made up of panels, and those panels were made by people to memorialise their loved ones who were lost during the HIV epidemic in the 80s and 90s particularly. Each panel usually memorialises like a particular person, like an individual who died of HIV-related complications, and yeah, we've got them all together for the first time since 1994.
The quilt panels need very little introduction from me. Everyone here has a personal connection to them and the emotions that they evoke, whether seeing them for the first time or revisiting them.
Acorn House, where the display is taking place, is an important building in the history of HIV in the UK. This building was owned by the Terence Higgins Trust, and it also housed a number of other HIV support charities. So it's been a place that many people have come to over the years in relation to their support needs around HIV. It was sold last year by the Terence Higgins Trust, which is why it's now empty.
All the other charities that were in Acorn House had left, had vacated. The food chain were the last remaining tenants. We had 5 empty floors. So when we had all of this space, it was just a bit of a brainwave really of why don't we use the space to exhibit the entirety of the quilts.
It's very, very rare that the quilts can all be displayed together because they are so huge. The last time was in Hyde Park, in London, was in Hyde Park in 1994.
There's something really special about it because it just resonates a moment in time like no other, really. It's a collaborative work. It has emotions that have come from multiple angles, and it's contained in this unique form.
When I first came, which was last week, I found myself incredibly moved by it, almost overwhelming really. I was so struck by the whole thing. I think there's something about the way in which they've done it here, the way it's been curated, and the volume that makes it a very, almost an immersive kind of experience.
It's a tribute to each individual life and what they meant, each individual person, what they meant to the person who made, or people who made the quilts, because it might have not just been one person, it could have been more.
Being positive, I know a lot of the history. I know how rough things were in the 80s and 90s, but to see it writ large in so many stories that we're never going to get to hear was very emotional for me.
It was hard work actually, just remembering all of those from my first decade of being diagnosed. I recognised a couple of the names of people who I would have met at Body Positive in the early years, so yeah, you just sort of get all those memories coming back, and then you slight survivor guilt for still being here.
We're just people, ordinary people with hopes and dreams. We are people who lived with HIV. We are people living with, no, not just living with, thriving with HIV. Thank you.
I'm old enough to remember when this all started, even to remember that none of us knew how it was going to pan out. A little bit like the present pandemic actually. Hearing about it, not taking it very seriously, to be blunt, not identifying with it. Of course, it became a quite different thing.
I think for the families and friends, it's a lovely way and a moving way, obviously, and very upsetting, you know, for lots of families. It really just reminds you of those hard times in the 1980s. and the 90s, you know, when people were going through such hardship, and that a lot of people who weren't in that field, you know, didn't realise the pain and suffering.
The one that has struck most people is a panel that looks like it's just pure white cloth, and then there's a small piece of text in the middle, and the text says something along the lines of, "This panel was made for a friend, by a friend. The parents do not want this panel to be displayed. They do not want his name associated with AIDS. Until the stigma changes, this panel will remain covered." And then there's a single red ribbon attached to it. Actually, when you look closer, you can see that around the edge of the white panel are safety pins. And then if you look even closer, you realise that the panel is actually still underneath. It's still part of the larger quilt, but it's been covered by this white sheet. So it's a real testament to the stigma that existed then, but that still exists now.
It's not about your lifestyle, it's about being a human being.
There was a reason, right, why these particular communities were not being named and not being remembered, which was to do with like who's recognised as disposable and who's recognised as like important to remember, and obviously a lot of stigma around talking about people living with HIV. And I think that's really relevant today as well, when we're looking at the coronavirus pandemic, who's being remembered, what steps are being taken to protect people, and who are those people, kind of thing.
Once upon a time, we used to think it was just exclusively, as it originally was, GRID, gay, related immune deficiency, and obviously it became HIV/AIDS because it wasn't just gay men, it was women, children, all ages.
There are still people that we work with at the food chain who just can't be associated with the word HIV. Sometimes they can't even say it. And that's because the stigma is still so intense that it forms a real barrier to good well-being and good health as well. It particularly strikes a nerve for us because we still see that stigma and we still see examples of it now, 40 years later.
For a number of years, the quilt panels were in storage. The Names Project closed down in the mid-1990s for good reasons, in that the medication arrived and people were living longer, and so there were far fewer deaths from HIV. So it was a good development that meant that the project wound down. So when I first saw them in Manchester, where they were being stored, they were in a cupboard stacked in canvas bags. And in all honesty, my first impression of them, it was like looking at a room of body bags. So that was a very strong incentive to work together with the other charities to try and bring them out of that cupboard.
The other important thing to remember about the Quilt project is that it's still open. It's not closed, even though the Names project, as it was in the 80s and 90s, has finished in that existence. The quilt is still very much a piece of living history, and we want people to contribute to it. We want people to keep it alive, keep the memories of those we lost in that period alive, but also people that we're still losing today. So it's very much still a part of the HIV community, and we want to keep it that way.
We very much hope that we'll be able to find a permanent home for the quilts, where they can be on permanent display, so people can go and see them and can interact with them and engage with them.
The entire country needs to see these stories just to realise just what HIV did in the 80s and the 90s. It's really humbling to live in the time that we do now, but people don't know the history, and I think they should.
So after today, the quilts will be folded up and packed away. They're stored at Positive East premises in East London, in Stepney. The partnership get no funding for the quilts, so we would like some funding for the project. We'd like some very rich benefactor to give us a couple of million, so we could find a premises that we could store them, display them, and conserve them, and also employ somebody, even on a part-time basis, to administer it and look after it.
I hope that the quilts will find a permanent home. I hope that the quilts will find professionals that will take care of them and restore them. Some of them have already started to degrade, and that's just really heartbreaking to see.
I think it would be wonderful if it could find a permanent home, or at least maybe tour the country so people get the chance to see it, and then find a permanent home so everyone gets to see this, and that these people are not forgotten, and that everyone can come and see and experience this.